In 1873, a dying woman named Elizabeth Crawford gathered her grandchildren around her bed in a small farmhouse outside Philadelphia and told them a story that seemed impossible. She said that in 1851, a pale, quiet man had walked into a slave auction in Virginia, paid $2,000 for her and her 2 infant sons, then rode them 3 miles into the woods and unlocked their chains. He handed her freedom papers, $50, and a map to Pennsylvania. When she asked his name, he said, "It's better if you never know." Then he disappeared into the forest and she never saw him again. For over 20 years, Elizabeth searched for this man, wanting to thank him, to repay him, to at least know who he was. She died without ever finding him. But she wasn't the only one searching. Across the country, hundreds of freed people told similar stories, a mysterious stranger who bought them at auction and immediately set them free. Some called him the Liberator, others called him the Shadow, but no one ever learned his real name, and in 1859 he vanished completely, leaving behind only whispers and mysteries. This is the story of the man who spent every penny he had buying human beings for the sole purpose of setting them free, and the secret that died with him, a secret that would take over 160 years to uncover. The carpenter's son. Daniel Thornton was never supposed to be anyone important. He was born in 1823 in a small town in Vermont, the 3rd son of a carpenter who drank too much and a mother who died of fever when Daniel was only 7 years old. His childhood was unremarkable. Chores before dawn, school when his father allowed it, work in the carpentry shop when he didn't. His older brothers, James and William, were strong and confident, natural leaders who commanded attention when they walked into a room. Daniel was the quiet one, the one people forgot was there, the one who watched and listened while others talked. But Daniel noticed things. He noticed the way his father's hands shook when he reached for the whiskey bottle. He noticed how the town doctor refused to treat the Irish immigrants who lived on the edge of town even when they were dying. He noticed the casual cruelty in how people talked about those they considered beneath them, the poor, the foreign, the different. Most of all, Daniel noticed the silence. When he was 14, a traveling preacher came through town and gave a sermon about the evils of slavery. The man spoke with fire in his voice about the millions of people held in bondage in the South, about families torn apart, children sold away from their mothers, human beings treated as property. Daniel sat in the back of the church, listening to every word, feeling something crack open inside his chest. After the sermon, as people filed out into the summer sunshine, Daniel heard the town's wealthiest merchant say to his wife, "Well, that was quite the performance. Shame he wastes his breath on such matters. The Negroes down south are probably better off as they are, fed, housed, and cared for. What would they do with freedom anyway?" His wife nodded. "Quite right. It's the natural order of things." Daniel waited for someone to object, to argue, to say anything, but the crowd simply dispersed, chatting about the weather and next week's harvest festival, as if they hadn't just heard a man describe the greatest moral crisis of their time. That night, lying on his thin mattress in the room he shared with his brothers, Daniel made a decision. He didn't know what he could do about slavery. He was just a carpenter's son in Vermont, with no money, no influence, no power. But he knew he had to do something, anything, because the silence was worse than the cruelty. He started reading everything he could find about slavery. He scraped together pennies to buy abolitionist newspapers. He attended every lecture and sermon he could reach. And slowly, an idea began to form in his mind. An idea that seemed both perfectly simple and absolutely insane. If enslaved people could be bought, then they could be bought and freed. It would take money. More money than Daniel had ever seen in his life. But he was 17 years old, and he was willing to work for it. For the next 8 years, Daniel worked like a man possessed. He apprenticed with his father until he mastered every aspect of carpentry, then took jobs in larger towns where the pay was better. He worked from before sunrise until after dark. He lived in the cheapest rooms he could find, ate the plainest food, wore the same clothes until they were little more than patches holding together patches. Every penny he didn't absolutely need to survive went into a wooden box hidden under his bed. His brothers thought he was insane. "What are you saving for?" James asked him once. "You planning to buy a mansion? Marry a rich girl?" Daniel just smiled and said something like that. He didn't tell them the truth. He didn't tell anyone, because he knew that if he spoke his plan out loud, people would tell him it was impossible, impractical, naive. They'd tell him that one man couldn't make a difference, that he'd be wasting his money, that there were better ways to fight slavery. But Daniel didn't want to fight slavery as a whole. He couldn't end the entire institution. He wasn't a politician or a wealthy philanthropist or a military leader. He was just a carpenter who'd learned to save money and who couldn't stop thinking about the families being sold at auction while the world went on eating breakfast and discussing the weather. If he could save even one person, that would be one person who wasn't in chains. And if he could save one person, maybe he could save two, and then three, and then as many as his life's work would allow. By the time Daniel turned 25, he had saved $1,847. It was an enormous sum, more than most working men saw in 5 years. He'd calculated carefully. The average price for an enslaved person at auction ranged from $800 to $1,500, depending on age, health, and skills. If he was careful, if he negotiated well, he might be able to free 2 people with what he'd saved. 2 people out of millions. It seemed absurd, pointless. But Daniel thought about those 2 people. He thought about them waking up in chains and going to sleep free. He thought about them being able to choose where they went, what they did, who they loved. He thought about them having children, and who would be born free. And he decided that 2 people mattered. In the spring of 1848, Daniel Thornton packed a small bag, hid his money in a belt sewn into the lining of his coat, and took a coach headed south. The journey to Virginia took 5 days. Daniel spent most of it staring out the window, watching the landscape change, feeling his stomach tighten with every mile that brought him closer to what he was about to do. He'd never been this far south before. He'd never been to a slave auction. He had no plan beyond the basic idea that had driven him for 8 years. When the coach finally arrived in Richmond, Daniel found a cheap boarding house and spent the night lying awake, listening to unfamiliar sounds and wondering if he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. The auction was scheduled for 10 o'clock the next morning. Daniel arrived at 9, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The auction house was a large wooden building near the river, with a platform out front where crowds were already gathering. Men in fine suits smoked and laughed. Women in expensive dresses fanned themselves in the morning heat. Children ran between their parents' legs, playing tag as if this were a country fair. And then Daniel saw them, 12 people, chained together in a line, standing to the side of the platform. Men, women, children. Some stood with their heads bowed. Others stared straight ahead with expressions of carefully controlled blankness. A woman near the end of the line held the hand of a girl who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. The child was crying silently, tears streaming down her face while her mother stroked her hair and whispered words Daniel couldn't hear. He felt his knees buckle. This wasn't an abstract concept anymore, wasn't something he'd read about in newspapers. These were real people, standing in chains, waiting to be sold like furniture or livestock. First time at an auction? Daniel turned to find an older man looking at him with amusement. The man was well-dressed, with a silver watch chain across his vest and an air of comfortable wealth. Yes, Daniel managed. Nothing to be nervous about. Just like buying a horse, really. Look them over carefully, check their teeth and muscles. Don't pay more than they're worth. The man gestured toward the platform. I'm in the market for a house servant myself. My wife wants one that can sew. You looking for field workers or domestic help? Daniel swallowed against the bile rising in his throat. I'm not sure yet. Well, take your time. Plenty of good stock here today. The man wandered off toward a group of other buyers. The auction began at 10 o'clock sharp. The first person brought to the platform was a man who looked to be in his 30s, tall and muscular. The auctioneer rattled off details in a practiced cadence. Strong buck, field-tested, no history of running, obedient disposition, as if describing a piece of machinery. The bidding started at $600 and climbed quickly. Daniel watched, his hands clenched at his sides, as the price rose to $900, then $1,000, then $1,200. The man sold for $1,350 to a plantation owner from North Carolina. Daniel did the math. At those prices, he might only be able to afford one person, not 2. The second person brought up was a woman in her 20s. The bidding start. D. at $700 and rose to $1,100 before slowing. Daniel's heart raced. This might be his chance. If he could get her for $1,200 or less, he'd still have enough money left to help her get started in freedom. $1,200, a voice called out. $1,300, another buyer countered. Daniel raised his hand before he could lose his nerve. $1,400. The crowd turned to look at him. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. $1,400 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 15? Silence. $1,400 once, twice. The gavel came down. Sold. Daniel could barely breathe as he approached the clerk's table. His hands shook so badly he could hardly count out the bills. $1,400. More than half his life savings gone in an instant. The clerk barely looked at him as he processed the paperwork. Name? Thomas? Thompson, Daniel lied, giving the first name that came to mind. Property will be ready for transport within the hour. You can collect her at the holding area. Property. The word made Daniel want to scream. He waited in an alley behind the auction house, his heart hammering, his mind racing through what he was about to do. What if someone stopped him? What if the woman thought he was just another slave owner and tried to run? What if the freedom papers weren't accepted and she was captured again? What if? Finally, a guard brought the woman out. She walked with her head down, her hands bound in front of her. She looked terrified. Here's your purchase, the guard said, handing Daniel a key to the restraints. You need help loading her into a wagon? No, Daniel said quickly. I can manage, thank you. The guard wand hurried back inside, and Daniel was left alone with the woman in the alley. She still hadn't looked up at him. Ma'am, Daniel said softly, I'm going to unlock those restraints now. Please don't be frightened. She flinched when he stepped closer but didn't move as he fumbled with the key. The lock clicked open, and the metal cuffs fell away from her wrists. She looked up at him then, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. My name is Daniel, he said quietly. I didn't buy you to enslave you. I bought you to set you free. She stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. Daniel reached into his coat and pulled out a document, a manumission paper he'd had drawn up by a lawyer in Pennsylvania before leaving. He'd filled in her physical description earlier, leaving the name blank until he could ask her what it was. This is a legal document declaring you a free person, he explained, his words tumbling out in a rush. I need to fill in your name. What should I write? Still she said nothing, just stared at him with an expression caught between disbelief and terror. Please, Daniel said. I know this seems impossible. I know you have no reason to trust me, but I swear on everything I believe in, I bought you only to free you. I have money to give you, not much, but enough to help you start over. And I have contacts in Pennsylvania who can help you build a new life. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. It was the same question Daniel had asked himself 1,000 times. Why was he doing this? What difference could one person make? Why spend everything he had on a gesture that wouldn't even dent the enormous evil of slavery? But standing in that all, looking at this woman who'd been sold like property just an hour ago, Daniel finally understood the answer. Because you matter, he said simply. Because your freedom matters. Because I can't save everyone, but I can save you. And maybe that's enough. Tears began streaming down the woman's face. My name is Sarah, she whispered. Sarah Johnson. Daniel carefully wrote her name on the manumission paper, then signed it himself and handed it to her. You're free, Sarah Johnson. Legally, officially free. This paper proves it. Sarah took the document with trembling hands, staring at it as if it might disappear. I have a son, she said suddenly. He was sold 3 years ago. I don't know where he is. I've been looking, but I can't. Her voice broke. Daniel felt his heart crack. I'm sorry. I wish I could help you find him. I wish I had enough money to buy and free everyone, but I only had enough for you. How much money you got left? Daniel checked his remaining funds. About $400. Sarah looked at the money, then at Daniel, then at the auction house behind them. That could buy a child. If we find one. Daniel started to say he couldn't, that he needed to get Sarah to safety, that he'd already done what he came to do. But then he thought about Sarah's son, somewhere in the South, still in chains while his mother stood here free. He thought about all the children he'd seen at the auction, crying or silent or too young to understand what was happening to them. "There's an auction in Petersburg tomorrow," Sarah said quietly. "Might be children there." Daniel made a decision that would change the course of his entire life. "Then I'll go to Petersburg," he said. They traveled through the night, Sarah wearing a disguise Daniel purchased, a simple dress and bonnet that might help her pass as a free woman. The journey was tense, every encounter with other travelers sending spikes of fear through both of them. But they made it to Petersburg without incident. The auction the next day was smaller than Richmond's, but no less horrifying. Daniel stood in the crowd, watching, waiting, his remaining money burning a hole in his pocket. Then a boy was brought to the platform. He was maybe 7 years old, small and thin, with eyes that looked far too old for his face. "Lot 17, the auctioneer announced. "Young buck, healthy, good for training in house or field work." The bidding started at $300. Daniel's hand shot up. 400. There was a pause. It was a high opening bid for such a young child. But then another voice called out, 450. Daniel's stomach dropped. He didn't have 450. He had exactly $387 left. He looked at Sarah, standing beside him in her disguise. She'd been free for less than 24 hours, and here they were at another auction, trying to save another life with money they didn't have. Sarah pulled something from the pocket of her dress, a small cloth bundle. She unwrapped it to reveal a silver ring, simple but clearly old. "This was my grandmother's," she said quietly. "Only thing I managed to keep through everything. It's worth maybe $50, $60. You take it. You bid again." "Sarah, no, you bid again," she said firmly, pressing the ring into his palm. "That boy deserves freedom as much as I do. Maybe more." Daniel held the ring, feeling its weight, feeling the weight of what Sarah was sacrificing. Then he raised his hand again. 500. The other bidder hesitated, then shook his head and walked away. "Sold." Daniel bought the boy, whose name was Jacob, and freed him in the same alley where he'd freed Sarah the day before. Jacob didn't speak at all, just stared at the manumission papers as if they were written in some incomprehensible code. "You understand?" Daniel asked gently. "You're free, both of you. You can go anywhere, do anything. You're not property anymore." Jacob looked up at him with those ancient eyes and said, "Where do I go?" It was such a simple question, and it broke Daniel's heart because he didn't have a good answer. He gave them the last of his money, $37 and a few coins, along with addresses of abolitionists in Pennsylvania who might help them. He gave them what advice he could about traveling safely, about using their papers if questioned, about finding work in the North. And then he watched them walk away, Sarah holding Jacob's hand, both of them carrying freedom papers and hope and almost nothing else, and Daniel realized something profound. He'd saved 2 people. He had no money left. By all practical measures, his plan was complete. But it didn't feel complete. It felt like he was just beginning. That night, sleeping in a barn because he couldn't afford a room, Daniel made a decision. He would go back to Vermont. He would work for another year, or 2 years, or however long it took to save enough money to do this again. He would buy one more person and set them free, and then he would save up and do it again. And again, for as long as his body held out and his conscience demanded it. He had no idea that this decision would consume the next 11 years of his life. He had no idea that he would eventually free not 2 people but dozens. He had no idea that he would become a ghost story, a legend, a mystery that people would try to solve for generations. All he knew, lying in that barn with his empty pockets and his full heart, was that 2 people were free because he'd lived. And tomorrow he would start working toward a third, the man who became a ghost. For the next 11 years, Daniel Thornton lived 2 lives. In one life, he was a carpenter and laborer who moved from town to town, taking whatever work paid best. He built houses in Pennsylvania, worked in a lumber mill in Maryland, spent 6 brutal months in a coal mine in Virginia. He lived in boarding houses that smelled of mold and unwashed bodies. He ate thin soup and stale bread. He wore clothes until they disintegrated, and then wore them some more. In his other life, he was a liberator. Every 12 to 18 months, Daniel would save enough money to make another trip south. Each time he varied his route, his appearance, his assumed name. He let his beard grow long and then shaved it off. He bought different styles of clothing. He developed different accents and mannerisms. Sometimes he posed as a plantation owner's agent. Other times he claimed to be buying labor for a construction project. Once, he pretended to be a merchant looking for skilled craftspeople. The slave traders never suspected that the same man kept appearing at different auctions under different names, buying people at top dollar and then disappearing with them. By 1852, Daniel had freed 17 people. He kept careful records in a journal that he hid with obsessive care. Not names. He never wrote down names in case the journal was discovered, but details. Woman, approximately 25, skilled seamstress, purchased for $1,100 in Charleston. Gave her $60 in papers to reach Philadelphia where she has family. Or, man, 30 seconds, literate, purchased for $1,400 in Savannah. Directed him to abolitionist contacts in Boston. Each entry ended with a running total of people freed and money remaining. The numbers were both encouraging and devastating. 17 people free, thousands of dollars spent, millions of people still in bondage. Daniel tried not to think about the millions. If he thought about the enormity of slavery, the endless horror of it, the impossibility of stopping it, he would collapse under the weight. So instead he thought about the 17. He thought about their faces when he unlocked their chains. He thought about them learning to write their own names as free people, finding work, building lives, having children who would never know bondage. 17 lives changed. That had to mean something. In the autumn of 1852, everything changed. Daniel had saved enough to potentially free 2 people if he was careful with his bidding. He traveled to an auction in New Orleans, one of the largest slave markets in the South. The scale of it was overwhelming. Hundreds of people being sold over 3 days, families torn apart, children crying, the casual cruelty of it all happening under a blazing sun while buyers laughed and made deals. On the second day, Daniel saw them. A woman, maybe 28 years old, standing on the platform with a baby, in her arms, and a little boy clinging to her skirt. The children were clearly hers. They had the same shaped eyes, the same curve to their cheeks. Lot 45, 46, and 47, the auctioneer announced. Prime breeding wench and her 2 offspring. Selling as a group or separately, your choice, gentlemen. Selling separately. Daniel felt something cold grip his spine. They would tear this family apart. They would sell the mother to one buyer, the children to another, and these 3 people would never see each other again. The bidding started at $800 for the group. 1,000. A plantation owner called out. 1,200, another voice countered. Daniel's mind raced. He had $1,600 saved. If the price went higher than that, he couldn't afford them. And even if he could buy them all, he'd have almost nothing left to give them for starting over. 1,500. Someone bid. Daniel raised his hand, his heart pounding. 1,600. Silence fell over the crowd. It was a steep price for a woman and 2 small children. The plantation owner, who'd bid $1,500, glared at Daniel, then turned away with a dismissive wave. Sold for 1,600. Daniel could barely feel his hands as he paid and received the transfer papers. When the guard brought the woman and her children to him, she was shaking so hard she could barely walk. The baby was wailing. The little boy stared up at Daniel with eyes full of terror. Daniel led them away from the auction house as quickly as he could, his mind spinning. He had exactly $23 left, $23 to give this woman with 2 small children a start in freedom. It wasn't enough. It was nearly enough. 3 miles from the city, in a grove of trees beside the road, Daniel stopped. His hands shook as he pulled out the key to their shackles. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I need you to listen carefully. I bought you and your children to set you free. I have manumission papers for all 3 of you. You're free, legally free." The woman stared at him with an expression of such profound disbelief that it was almost painful to witness. "Why?" she whispered. "Because you deserve to be free," Daniel said. "Because your children deserve to grow up free. Because I can't stand by and do nothing." He unlocked their chains one by one. The metal fell away, and the woman pulled her children close, holding them as if they might disappear. "My name is Elizabeth," she said through tears. "This is Mary," she gestured to the baby, "and this is Thomas." Daniel carefully filled out 3 manumission papers, writing each name with a hand that wouldn't stop trembling. When he finished, he pulled out his remaining money. "This is all I have left," he said, handing her the $23. "I'm sorry it's not more. There's a community of free black folks in New Orleans who might help you. I can give you an address." "You gave me everything," Elizabeth interrupted, staring at the pitifully small amount of money. "You spent $1,600 to buy us, and now you giving me your last dollars." Tears streamed down her face. "Who are you?" Daniel hesitated. He'd been careful never to give his real name, never to leave traces that could be followed. But looking at Elizabeth and her children, at the family he just kept together, he felt the weight of anonymity pressing down on him. "It's better if you don't know," he said finally. "Better if no one knows. If word gets out about what I'm doing, it could make things harder. Prices might go up. People might start watching for me." Elizabeth studied his face for a long moment. "You've done this before." It wasn't a question. "Yes," Daniel admitted. "How many?" 17. "Including you and your children, 20. Elizabeth closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were blazing with determination. "Then you need more money to save more people." She reached into the bundle of possessions she'd been allowed to keep, pitifully few items wrapped in a tattered cloth, and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a pair of silver earrings. "These were my mother's," she said. "She gave them to me before she was sold away when I was 10. I kept them hidden for 18 years. She pressed the box into Daniel's hands. "You take these. You sell them. You use the money to save someone else." "I can't," Daniel started. "You can and you will," Elizabeth said firmly. "Because what good are these earrings to me if I'm the only one who gets saved? You take them. You save another family. You save as many as you can until you can't save no more, and you let my mama's earrings be part of that. Let them mean something." Daniel stood in that grove of trees, holding the box of earrings, and felt something shift inside him. He'd thought of his mission as solitary, one man trying to do what little he could. But Elizabeth was making it something more. She was making it a shared effort, a chain of sacrifice and hope extending from person to person. "Thank you," he whispered. Elizabeth embraced him, this stranger who'd given her freedom, and Daniel held her and her children for a long moment before they parted. He sold the earrings the next day for $85. Combined with what he could earn over the next year, it would be enough to free at least one more person. 21, 22, 23. Over the years that followed, a pattern developed. Nearly every person Daniel freed found some way to contribute to the next rescue. Some gave him jewelry or other small valuables they'd managed to keep. Others worked extra jobs and sent him money through carefully arranged contacts. A man Daniel freed in 1853 became a successful blacksmith and sent him $200 a year later with a note that read, "For the next one." Daniel was no longer working alone. He was part of a network, a silent, invisible network of people who'd been freed and were now helping to free others. The work became more sophisticated. Daniel developed contacts among abolitionists who provided safe houses and forged documents. He learned which auction houses were most corrupt and could be bribed for information. He discovered routes through the South that were relatively safe for traveling with newly freed people, and he became more cautious. By 1855, rumors were starting to circulate among slave traders about a mysterious buyer who appeared and disappeared like smoke. Some called him the Ghost, others called him the Shadow. A few plantation owners became suspicious enough to hire men to watch for unusual buyers, but Daniel always stayed one step ahead, changing his appearance, his methods, his patterns. The work aged him faster than the years should have. By the time he was 35, his hair was streaked with gray, and his face was lined with exhaustion. The coal mine work had left him with a persistent cough that sometimes brought up blood. His joints ached from years of hard labor and poor sleeping conditions, but he never stopped. 25 freed, 30, 40. In 1857, Daniel freed a teenage girl named Hannah in Mobile, Alabama. She'd been about to be sold to a brothel, something that made Daniel physically sick to contemplate. He paid an exorbitant $2,000 for her, money he'd spent 2 years saving, and brought her to a safe house run by Quaker abolitionists. The night after he freed her, Daniel collapsed. The Quakers found him unconscious in their barn, burning with fever. They nursed him for 3 weeks while he drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes delirious, sometimes thrashing with nightmares about auction blocks and chains. When he finally recovered enough to sit up, the Quaker woman who'd been caring for him, a gentle soul named Margaret, sat beside his bed and said quietly, "Thee is killing thyself with this work." "I know," Daniel said. "Why does thee continue?" Daniel looked at his hands, scarred from carpentry work, calloused from labor, trembling with weakness. "Because if I stop, who will they be? The ones I could have saved but didn't because I was too tired or too sick or too scared. How do I live with that?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Thee has freed 43 people. How many more does thee think thee can save before thy body gives out entirely?" Daniel had thought about this question many times. He was 34 years old and felt like 60. His cough was getting worse. His chest sometimes hurt so badly he could barely breathe. He might have 5 years left if he was lucky, maybe 10 if he was careful. "Maybe 30 more," he said. "Maybe 40 if I can save enough money quickly." "And if thee dies tomorrow," Margaret asked gently, "those 43 people are still free. Their children will be born free. Thee has already done more than most people could dream of doing." "It's not enough," Daniel whispered. "It's never enough." But he knew Margaret was right. His body was failing. If he wanted to free as many people as possible before he couldn't continue, he needed to work smarter, faster. Over the next 2 years, Daniel intensified his efforts. He took the most dangerous jobs because they paid the most, working on steamships, in factories, in places where safety regulations were suggestions rather than rules. He pushed his body past every reasonable limit. He saved money at a rate that would have been impossible if he'd valued his own health at all, and he freed people. Hannah, Marcus, Abraham, Rebecca and her 3 children, Samuel, Catherine, James, 50 freed, 60, 70. The numbers climbed while Daniel's health deteriorated. His cough became constant. He grew so thin that his clothes hung off his frame. Sometimes he spit blood into his handkerchief and kept working anyway. The freed people tried to help. They pooled money, sent care packages, begged him to rest. But Daniel had calculated how much time he likely had left, and he was racing against his own mortality. In early 1859, Daniel freed his 98th person, a woman named Grace who'd been enslaved for 53 years. When he handed her the manumission papers, she looked at him with eyes that had seen every horror imaginable and said, "You're dying, aren't you?" Daniel didn't insult her by lying. "Yes." "How long?" "Maybe a year, maybe less." Grace reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Then you make every day count. You save as many as you can, and when you can't save no more, you rest knowing you changed the world for every single person you freed." "I didn't change the world," Daniel said. "I just helped a few people." "You think I don't matter?" Grace asked fiercely. "You think 53 years of slavery ending right now because of you doesn't matter? You think my great-great-grandchildren being born free instead of in chains doesn't matter?" She squeezed his hand harder. "You changed the whole world for me, and you changed it for everyone you freed. Don't you dare diminish that." Daniel freed 9 more people over the next 6 months. With each rescue, he felt his body breaking down further. By autumn, he could barely walk a mile without stopping to rest. His cough was so bad that some nights he couldn't sleep at all. In October 1859, Daniel made his final trip south. He had exactly $1,200 saved, probably enough for 1 more person, maybe 2 if he found children. He traveled to a small auction in Mississippi, moving slowly, stopping frequently to catch his breath. The auction was smaller than most he'd attended, with maybe 20 people being sold. Daniel stood at the back of the crowd, leaning heavily on a walking stick he'd begun carrying, watching each person brought to the platform. Then he saw her, an old woman, easily in her 70s, hunched and frail. The auctioneer seemed almost embarrassed. Said to present her. "House servant," he mumbled. "Can still cook and clean simple tasks. Gentle disposition. We'll start the bidding at $50. No one bid. Who wanted an enslaved person so old she might die within the year? Daniel raised his hand. $50. The auctioneer looked relieved. Sold. It was the easiest purchase Daniel had ever made. He paid the $50, received the papers, and led the old woman away. Her name was Rose, and she moved so slowly that their walk to the edge of town took over an hour. When they were finally alone, Daniel unlocked her chains for the 107th time. "You're free," he told her, his voice rough from coughing. "Here are your papers. You're legally a free woman." Rose stared at the papers, then at Daniel, then at her wrists where the chains had been. "I'm 74 years old," she said slowly. "I've been enslaved since I was 4 years old, 70 years in chains. And now I'm free." "Now you're free," Daniel confirmed. Rose began to laugh, a sound like church bells and breaking glass mixed together. 70 years, she kept saying. 70 years and now I'm free. Why? Because you deserved to be free 70 years ago, Daniel said. Because you deserve to spend whatever time you have left as a free woman. Because you matter. He gave her the remaining $1,150 he had, along with contacts for abolitionists who could help her. It was far more than he'd given most people, but he wouldn't need it anymore. This was his last rescue. Rose took the money with shaking hands, then looked at Daniel, really looked at him, at his gaunt face and gray skin and the way he swayed on his feet even whilst standing still. "You're sick," she said. "Yes. How many people you freed before me?" 106. Rose's eyes widened. 106 people? You bought and freed 106 people, 107 including you. Why? She asked again. Why you do this? Daniel thought about all the answers he'd given over the years. Because it was right, because they deserved freedom, because he couldn't stand by and do nothing. But standing there at the end of his mission, with Rose looking at him with those ancient wise eyes, he gave her the truest answer. "Because I needed to know that my life mattered," he said quietly. "I needed to know that I did something good in this world, and every person I freed was proof that I'd lived for something beyond myself." Rose stepped forward and embraced him, this dying white man who'd spent everything he had buying people he'd never met for the sole purpose of setting them free. She held him while he coughed and wheezed, and when they finally parted, she said, "You got any family?" "No." "Any friends who know what you done?" "No." "It's safer that way." Rose nodded slowly. "Then you gonna die alone and no one gonna know your name or what you did." "I know," Daniel said. "That's how it has to be." "What is your name?" Rose asked. "Your real name, not the fake ones you've been using." Daniel hesitated. He'd kept his real name secret for 11 years. But what did it matter now? He was dying. His work was done. "Daniel," he said. "Daniel Thornton." "Daniel Thornton," Rose repeated, as if committing it to memory. "I'm gonna tell my children and my grandchildren about you. I'm gonna make sure they know that a man named Daniel Thornton bought me free when I was 74 years old. I'm gonna make sure your name lives on, even if you don't." "Thank you," Daniel whispered. They parted ways that evening. Rose headed toward the abolitionist contacts he'd given her. Daniel returned to a boarding house in town, climbing the stairs to his rented room with agonizing slowness. That night, he made his final journal entry. Rose. October 15, 1859. Age approximately 74. 70 years enslaved. Now free. Number 107. I have freed 107 people. I have spent every penny I ever earned. I have given 11 years of my life to this work, and it has cost me everything, my health, my youth, any chance at a normal life. I am 36 years old and dying. I have no family, no fortune, no legacy that will be remembered. But 107 people walk this earth as free human beings because I lived. 107 people who were property are now people with their own lives and choices and futures. Their children will be born free. Their grandchildren will be born free. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that has to be enough. I don't know if I changed the world, but I know I changed their world. And maybe that's all any of us can hope to do. Change the world for someone. Daniel Thornton died 3 weeks later in that boarding house room. The landlady found him and, seeing that he had no possessions and no one to contact, had him buried in a pauper's grave with no marker. She threw away his few belongings, including a worn journal that she couldn't read anyway. Daniel Thornton disappeared from history without a trace. But the people he freed didn't forget. Rose told her children, who told their children. Elizabeth told her story to her grandchildren as she lay dying in 1873. Hannah became a teacher and told her students about the man who'd saved her. Marcus named his son Daniel, though he never knew why, just that his father had told him it was a name to honor. Over the years, more stories emerged, scattered accounts from freed people across the South and North, all telling similar tales of a mysterious man who bought them at auction and immediately set them free. The details varied. Some remembered him as young, others as middle-aged, some said he was tall, others average height. But the core story was always the same. He bought them, he freed them, he gave them money and papers and hope, and then he disappeared. Historians who later encountered these stories dismissed many of them as folklore or exaggeration. The idea that one man could have freed over 100 people seemed implausible, especially since there was no documentary evidence, no name, no records, no proof. But in 1923, a researcher studying auction house records in Virginia noticed something odd. Between 1848 and 1859, there were 107 recorded sales where the buyer paid top dollar, took possession of the enslaved person, and then both buyer and purchase disappeared from all subsequent records. The buyers all had different names, but the pattern was consistent across multiple cities and auction houses. The researcher wrote an article proposing that these disappearances represented a single individual conducting a long-term liberation effort. The article was largely ignored by mainstream historians, but became popular in black communities, where the oral histories had kept the story alive. In 1968, during the Civil Rights Movement, a journalist named Marcus Freeman IV published a book called The Ghost Who Bought Freedom. In it, he compiled dozens of family stories about ancestors who'd been mysteriously purchased and freed between 1848 and 1859. He included genealogical research showing that these freed individuals went on to have families, build communities, and create legacies. One of the most moving chapters focused on a woman named Rose who'd been freed at age 74 in 1859 and had told her descendants about a dying man named Daniel Thornton who'd bought her freedom with his last money. Marcus Freeman IV hired researchers to search historical records for any Daniel Thornton who might match the timeline. They found one, Daniel Thornton, born 1823 in Vermont, son of a carpenter. The record showed he'd worked various jobs across the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states between 1840 and 1859. There were no records of him owning property, no marriage certificate, no children. He simply worked, moved from place to place, and in 1859 disappeared entirely. Was he the liberator? The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. The timeline matched. The geographic locations of his work matched the locations of the mysterious auction disappearances. And there was Rose's testimony, passed down through 4 generations, naming him specifically. In 2019, a DNA analysis project connected nearly 300 living individuals to ancestors who'd been mysteriously freed between 1848 and 1859. The project identified a common pattern. All of these ancestors had been purchased in the final months before the Civil War by buyers who paid premium prices and then vanished. The mathematicians who worked on the project calculated that if one person had freed 107 people, and those people had typical family sizes for freed individuals in the 19th century, there could now be over 10,000 living descendants. 10,000 people whose ancestors walked free because one man spent everything he had buying them. 10,000 people whose existence was shaped by a carpenter from Vermont who couldn't stand the silence. Today, there's a small memorial in Richmond, Virginia, near where one of the largest auction houses once stood. It's a simple stone marker that reads, "In memory of the liberator," believed to be Daniel Thornton, 1823 to 1859, who purchased enslaved people for the sole purpose of setting them free. Though his name was nearly lost to history, his legacy lives on in the thousands who descend from the 107 people he freed. He gave everything he had so that strangers could be free. May we all find such purpose. Every October 15th, the date of Daniel's final rescue, descendants of the freed gather at memorials across the country. They tell the stories passed down through their families. They honor not just Daniel Thornton, but all the people he freed who went on to build lives and families and futures. And they remind themselves that one person can make a difference, not by solving every problem, not by ending slavery single-handedly or changing the entire world, but by choosing to help someone, by seeing suffering and refusing to look away, by giving what you have, even when it costs you everything. Daniel Thornton was never rich or powerful or famous. He didn't lead armies or change laws or give speeches that inspire red nations. He was just a carpenter who saved his money and freed people one at a time, working in silence and obscurity until his body gave out and he died alone in a boarding house room. But 107 people walked free because he lived. 107 people who had children, who had grandchildren, who built communities and businesses and families, who created legacies that spread out like ripples in a pond, touching thousands of lives across generations. That's the power of one person who decides that someone else's freedom matters more than their own comfort. That's the legacy of the man who purchased slaves only to set them free and vanished forever. Daniel Thornton is gone. His name was almost lost, but his impact echoes through time in every descendant of the people he freed, in every person inspired by his story, in every act of quiet compassion that changes a life without seeking recognition. The question isn't whether we can change the world for everyone. The question is, will we change the world for someone? Because in the end, that's all that any of us can do. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. I have freed 107 people. I have no family, no fortune, no legacy that will be remembered. But 107 people walk this earth as free human beings because I lived. Maybe that's enough. Final journal entry of Daniel Thornton, October 15, 1859.